Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about regulation and homeostasis of the respiratory system. And if you haven't watched the first two videos in this series, go back and watch them. The first one is structures of the respiratory system, and the second one is physiology of the respiratory system. This is where we left off. We were talking about how inspiration is an active process based on contraction of muscles, and expiration is a passive process where the muscles relax, the diaphragm comes back up, the external intercostal muscles come back in, and that changes the volume of the lungs and therefore the pressure of the lungs. So how is this controlled? And in order to talk about how this is controlled, first we have to go back and do a quick review of homeostasis. So homeostasis is the tendency of the body to try to maintain balance. So, for example, we might have a certain temperature set point. We don't want to get too hot and we don't want to get too cold. If we start to get too hot, we're going to do something to bring our temperature back down. If we start to get too cold, we're going to do something to bring our temperature back up. Other things that we control would be our blood glucose level, our calcium level, using the skeleton as our calcium reserve. And in terms of the respiratory system, what we're really concerned with here is our carbon dioxide level, our hydrogen, or our pH, which is basically a measurement of hydrogen ion concentration, and our oxygen levels. So these are the three that are important in the respiratory system. So do you remember when we first started talking about homeostasis, we said there was something that would change. So say your temperature changed. That would be the stimulus, the thing that changed. That stimulus was going to be picked up by receptors. So the change would be brought to the attention of the control center by the receptors. The control center would then attempt to fix the problem by telling some kind of effector to do something. And the hope is that if you had a negative feedback system, the effectors would go back and get rid of that initial stimulus. So for example, if we moved out of the ideal range for temperature, we would have thermoreceptors, temperature receptors, pick up that difference, that stimulus, and the hypothalamus is the control center for temperature regulation, and it would tell effectors, depending on whether you're too hot or too cold, to do something to change you back to the normal temperature. Now, in the respiratory system, we're really looking at the concentration of these chemicals. So our receptors are going to be chemoreceptors, because chemoreceptors bind to chemicals and will bring the information to the control center. So the stimulus in this case is going to be a change in CO2 or pH primarily, but also in some cases oxygen. The receptors are going to be what we call chemoreceptors. So if there's too much CO2, it will bind to chemoreceptors, and the chemoreceptors will take that information to an area of the brain called the medulla oblongata. This is part of the brainstem. The medulla oblongata is going to change the respiratory rate to take care of the problem here. So it's still homeostasis. We're using the same model. All we've put in are the specifics. What is the stimulus? What is the type of receptor? What is the control center for these set points? And what we're going to do over here, we're going to either increase or decrease the respiratory rate. So if you look here, this is a picture from your book. You can see the brain is up here, and the respiratory center is the medulla. Now the medulla is attached to the external intercostals and the diaphragm via a special nerve called the phrenic nerve. And when the medulla receives information that there's a problem with either CO2, pH, or O2, it's going to send signals down the phrenic nerve to either increase the respiratory rate, so breathe faster, or decrease the respiratory rate. So you might be wondering why CO2 and pH are so important for respiratory rate and how they're related to each other. And it's because of this equation. If you take carbon dioxide and you add it together with water, you end up with something called carbonic acid. So this is carbonic acid. And if you look, you still have 2 hydrogens, 1 carbon, and you have 3 oxygens. So you haven't added any elements to it. We've just combined them in a different way. Now, carbonic acid has a choice. It can dissociate, which basically means fall apart, into carbon dioxide and H2O, or it can dissociate slightly differently into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. And if you'll notice, do you see this hydrogen ion here? Do you remember way back when we learned about pH, we learned that pH is really the concentration of hydrogen ions in solution. So a pH that's low is going to be acidic and is going to have lots of hydrogen ions. A pH that's high, above 7, is basic and is going to have very little hydrogen ions. It has a lot more hydroxide, which is the OH. Okay? So the way this works in the body is if the body wants to maintain homeostasis, and bicarbonate is considered a buffer, which means that it can bind up hydrogen ions and change the pH or maintain the pH. So if there's too many hydrogen ions, it can bind to bicarbonate, form carbonic acid, and then dissociate into carbon dioxide and water. Neither one of these is going to affect pH, but this does affect pH. So we can kind of mop it up, if you will, with the buffer, bicarbonate ion buffer, and force it to become these chemicals which do not change the pH. Now the other thing you have to remember is that CO2, we can actually excrete that. We can get rid of it from the body. So if you need to bind up hydrogen ions and you form carbonic acid and allow it to dissociate, and then you breathe out the CO2 is gone. We can't form carbonic acid with that molecule of CO2 anymore. And so we've essentially bound up this hydrogen and taken it out of solution. So how does this work in sort of a real life situation? So imagine you decide, I'm going to hold my breath. And you've got, your little kid, and you say, I'm going to hold my breath until you do what I want. So the first thing that's going to happen when you hold your breath is that your CO2 is going to go way up because you're not breathing it out. You're not excreting it. So you're going to end up with a whole bunch of CO2. Now, there's never really a shortage of water in the body. And so we're going to force this equation to go to the right. Do you see up here, I drew it with arrows going both ways? Here, I'm going to only have an arrow going to the right because we have so much CO2. The H2CO3 is not going to dissociate in this direction. There's already a lot of CO2 there. And so when it does dissociate, it's going to dissociate into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions. So we're going to start getting a lot of hydrogen ions. And when you have a lot of hydrogen ions, it's actually going to force the pH to go down. So when you hold your breath for too long, the pH is going to go way down and your CO2 is going to go way up. And remember, we have chemo receptors. that are there to monitor the pH and the CO2 of the blood. And when it sees CO2 going up and pH going down, the chemoreceptors are going to signal the medulla and tell the medulla that there's an issue with the chemicals of the blood, with the pH and CO2 levels of the blood. The medulla is going to activate the receptors that are going to increase the respiratory rate. Now you're going to start breathing faster, and you will breathe off and excrete the carbon dioxide out, which should even out this problem. Instead of only going to the right, the equation will start to go to the left again. pH will come back up, and CO2 will go back down as it's being breathed out. Now, suppose you have the opposite problem. Instead of holding your breath, you're hyperventilating. You're having a panic attack, you're hyperventilating. So you're actually losing CO2. This is not a good situation either, because when you lose CO2, the body doesn't like an imbalance, and so it's actually going to try and create more CO2 by allowing bicarbonate or by allowing carbonic acid to dissociate and push this equation to the left.